Okay, okay. Welcome to everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I hope you are well. And this is our not the last day because I will announce later news for you, but this is our last schedule talks, live talks. And this is a very special day because we have a special panelist, Peter Senge, and I'm sure that we will have a great experience and great knowledge in this day. Then welcome everybody. I want to ask Tim to present Peter, and then we can start. Peter wants to do a different talk today, a very interactive talk with you guys. Then welcome, Peter. Tim, can you introduce Peter to us?
He's impossible to introduce, but we have been somehow friends and aligned in our work for 45 years, something. And Peter has become known for the thought leader of learning within organization. And it turns out to be a very different kind of learning when you have to think in terms of every other component in the organization before you make your decision. And it's easy to think it's simpler than it really is. But many organizations have tried it. We've shared the stage in several different conferences and always felt aligned because we noticed that organizations are made up of people. It was a very unique idea instead of made up of positions and functions. And so people started to make their decisions based on people, both what they can bring and, as we know, the interferences they can bring, as well as the insight and understanding they can bring. So I wanted Peter to close our speaker list. Renato, how many speakers have we had?
Oh, we have, if we count live and recorded, we have more than 35.
Oh, 35 in 8 days?
Yes, 8 days.
So close to 5 or 6 a day. So they have had a lot to take in. And I think Peter is going to ask you to connect it all in your head and see what stands out for you as far as what you have learned or seen or beginning to learn and see that wasn't there when you came into the conference. So Peter, with that.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's really great to be part of this. When Tim reached out to me, it was probably 2-3 months ago. As you know, as happens, probably not good or bad. It's you feel a little bit sad about this sometimes. It's been a long time since Tim and I have seen each other and spoken. So I was delighted to hear from him, delighted to hear about the conference. And obviously all of us are becoming Zoom denizens, whatever is the right phrase. We're living in this new universe, and it's difficult because it's a little bit like when people first had automobiles and they ran out of gas, they just hitched it to a horse and used it as a wagon. It's very natural for us to kind of try to do all the things we're used to doing when we're together in this new format. But in the last month and a half or two now, I've probably led or co-led uh, 10, 15 different workshops where we've experimented with a lot of different ways to use this medium to do something that's akin. I won't say it's similar. It's related, but it's has some of the qualities of what we would do when we have people together, which is to say, it's reflective. People get to think. They get to ponder what the connection is between some idea or some tool or something, let's just say, that's external to me and my own work, my own life, the things I really care about. They get to do it together. So we've been experimenting with a lot of different ways that people can feel a sense of learning with and from each other, not just from some presenter. And ultimately, in the sense that we all understand, at least intuitively, and certainly Tim has been a great exponent of this, there's no learning without doing. Learning is doing. Knowing is doing. How do you know what you know? Look what you can do. How do you know what you really understand? Look what you create. Look what you kind of bring into reality. Uh, this is the first fundamental error that we all get caught up in. I don't think it's innately a human confusion. I think it's an institutional confusion. When we were 2 or 3 years old, we knew darn well we didn't know anything about walking except as we walked, or we didn't know anything about riding a bicycle except as we rode a bicycle. Then, of course, we go to school and we get all confused. And the biggest confusion that schools produce is you now get this whole new concept of learning. It's in the head. We all remember, sitting still in the classroom. And, for many of us, it was the hardest thing we could have done. I can't move around because I know that I learned through moving. And then we develop this wholly different sense of learning, an intellectualized, conceptualized sense. And how do you know what you know? Well, you pass a test. I'll never forget, I think our oldest son was probably about 9 or 10, and he had an epiphany. And he said, I got it. It's about guessing what's in the teacher's head. And he used to come home when he was doing all his exams. He said, I got to empty out my head so I could fill it up with a bunch of new stuff for my exam tomorrow. I mean, you think about it, it's such a cockamamie set of ideas, but we all get immersed in it. And then the confusion starts, and we confuse ideas, factual knowledge, a bunch of stuff we've read with what we actually know. So in English, there's a perfectly good phrase, there's knowing about and there's knowing how. I think the only thing that gets confused is we start to think that knowing about is the equivalent of knowing how. Think of all the things you know about that you don't know how to do. And in the end, which of the two really matters? So that's been a journey that's always connected Tim and me. I think we first met, you get to a certain point and you go, a long time ago. You stop trying to count up the years. And I noticed a few years back, I started using the term decades instead of years. Oh, we met a few decades ago. But I can remember vividly the meeting. We were in a conference hosted by a big healthcare organization. It was in Southern California. And of course, I knew of Tim. Tim's Inner Game had come out earlier than that, and I'd heard of it and was very intrigued. But I'll never forget watching him show a film he used to use a lot. I would say video. It certainly wasn't on disc. It was probably, literally could have been a film, or it could have been a VCR. But anyhow, regardless of the medium, of a lady who he's teaching how to play tennis. And you hear Tim's voice. Maybe many of you have seen this video. It's so famous. You hear Tim's voice in the background. He's just hitting the ball over the net to this lady on the other side. And it's clear that she's a novice. In fact, if I recall right, she misses the ball with her racket several times early on, and then she starts to hit it a little more frequently. And all Tim is doing the whole time is saying, well, what happened? What happened? What happened? What happened? Or something to that effect. And then she starts to hit it on her racket a little more frequently. Oh, what happened? Oh, I hit it on my racket. Ah, what happened? It hit on the wood, because that was in the days when I think maybe her racket was actually a wooden tennis racket. Uh, and then gradually, the magic of it is, as this goes on, if I recall, the film runs for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. It's not long.
That was the time limit that they imposed.
Yeah.
See what she can learn in 20 minutes.
Well, that's what I recall, because it's stunning as you watch this. You watch a woman who goes from literally not being able to hit the ball with a tennis racket almost half the time to actually having a rally with Tim, literally having a rally back and forth where she's hitting it and she's returning it, and she's hitting it and returning it. And it's stunning. It's one of the most stunning demonstrations of the capacity of humans to learn that I've ever seen, and I've never forgotten it. And of course, what you're really interested in, what we're all really interested in, whether you're a teacher or a manager or a coach, what's the pedagogy? How is this guy doing this? How does he help this lady go from hardly being able to hit a tennis ball with a tennis racket to actually being able to carry on a rally in 15 or 20 minutes? And it's so clear that it's incredibly simple at one level and very, very sophisticated at another. It's all about observation. He's just getting her to observe. But along the way, he's helping her deal with all the things that keep her from observing. Oh, I'll never be able to do this. I'm not very good at this. All the kind of self-talk, we all have it. It's a little different for each of us, but it's not really much different. All the internalized little storylines we've picked up over our lifetime to tell us that we're either incapable or unworthy. I mean, usually it's the incapable ones that come out first, but oftentimes behind that, well, I don't deserve this. I'm not that type of person. I sinned when I was in who knows what. But it was such a beautiful example of the power of simply letting someone be aware of their self-talk, their inner chatter, while trying to do something they want to be able to do. And the beauty of it, of course, is that the way this system works innately is that you don't have to make all those negative thoughts go away. You don't have to convince yourself a good person. You don't have to convince yourself you're a capable person. You just have to be doing what you want to be doing and notice. In a sense, Tim is a brilliant teacher of meditation, because it's the first principle of all meditation. You don't try to make those thoughts go away. You just notice them. They go away on their own. I had a teacher in China for a long time who used to use a wonderful metaphor for this. He said, well, the thoughts that arise in your meditation, he said, you can think of them like house guests who have stayed too long. If you pay attention to them, they'll stay longer. If you start to ignore them, after a while, they'll just go. So that beautiful kind of innate capacity of our awareness to just notice things, and if we don't obsess about them, if we don't give them too much attention, just notice them gently and go back to what we really want to do, or go back to what we really want to be able to think about, the system corrects itself. I just thought it was brilliant, and I've never forgotten it. As you can tell, it's as much fun for me. In fact, I could probably take 20 minutes retelling this story, but it was so striking to me because our work at that time was pretty much in the stage. Probably we've been working for maybe 8 to 10 years, starting mostly with teams, engineering teams, sales teams, in this context. How do they kind of develop a team that can really be more and more capable? In other words, a team that can learn. Is literally, to me, all that learning means ultimately is you go from here to here. It's a process whereby human beings enhance their capacities to create outcomes they really want to create. So it's learning to ride a bicycle is no different than learning to talk, which is no different than learning algebra, which is no different than learning what a team is trying to learn together to create a kind of quality of product in a certain amount of time at a certain cost. So the particulars all vary, but the learning process transcends the particulars. So that was my core interest. And when I watched this video of Tim's, I thought, well, that's it. That's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to unleash the capacity of this innate ability to learn. Tim was not teaching the lady how to learn. The lady knew how to learn. He was helping her remove blockages that kept her from her own natural learning capacity. And it was very clarifying, as you can tell, as I tell the story now. I'll say a few more words about the journey, since obviously there's been a few things that have happened since I first met Tim in whenever it was, 1980 something or other. Um, and at that time, all of the work we were doing was, again, in the business context, and it was mostly with teams, working teams. Eventually, of course, we started to work also with management teams. Management teams are different than, I call a working team. It could be sales, it could be engineering, it could be manufacturing. It doesn't really matter. A group of people who've got to help each other accomplish something. And the something is ultimately something tangible. So that's what I mean by a working team. And in that sense, all organizations are made up of working teams. And one of the big, I would say, enlightenments of business in the last 30 years has been nowadays, most people are organized in teams. That didn't used to be the case. Everybody just focused on the hierarchy. And the old joke at Ford was, you don't have to worry about your customer. You just please your boss. He is your customer. So this confusion of pleasing someone above you in the hierarchy with actually doing something of value for someone the organization is trying to serve is a deep confusion. And so helping people organize in teams, and they really think, well, who is the team trying to serve? It could be an internal customer, and ultimately, obviously, it's always to some degree an external customer. So anyhow, that was the journey. And gradually, yeah, we worked more with management teams. As I said, they're a little different, because if you think about it, the function of a management team is to enable, not to produce. What I call a working team is a team that's got to produce something. It could be a satisfied customer, it could be a sale, it could be a product, it could be all kinds of things. But there's a lot of other teams that are also really important in organizations, which are there to enable the working teams. But their work is by its nature a little subtler, because how do you know if you're successful in enabling? Well, obviously it's the productivity and the effectiveness of those working teams that tells you you actually have been good at enabling. But we all get confounded. It happens in most every organization I've ever been part of. Hierarchy tends to confer the image of status or importance. I'll never forget a CEO. Back around this time, I got to know Tim. It was our first kind of effort to organize a small group of executives from different organizations who are all trying to create this sort of environment within their respective organizations. And how could they learn from each other? I'll never forget one of the guys who was very eminent and now retired and quite famous in Massachusetts. He founded something called the Mass High Technology Council many, many years ago. I'll never forget Ray saying, my vision is to have the people in my organization not feel the person lower in the hierarchy is somehow a lesser being. They're just in a different role. And in the end, every role matters. If it doesn't, then why does the role even exist? In principle, every role should matter. And someone can't do their job well in their role, everybody suffers. So we're all interconnected. And yet we often overlay this kind of status hierarchy as opposed to functional hierarchies. Hierarchies aren't bad or good, they're perfectly functional. You need those levels of management to help create enabling environments. A little after I got to know Tim, started a journey, lasted for about 12, 13 years, with a strategic partnership with the US Army. And that was really fun for me because, the military are the archetypal hierarchy. And I think I was fortunate to kind of get to work with them at a good time and had partnerships with a series of 4, what they would call chief of staff in the Army. So that's the senior person in the Army. And they were working diligently, and I thought very creatively, to not destroy their hierarchy, but to have their hierarchy work. And one of the key ideas they used for this, and it's become a cornerstone along the journey in our work, is they were redefining what it meant to be a leader. So in that confused state where the hierarchy confers status, not just function, it confers status, you tend to think the leaders are them. They have a saying in the US Army, your first day as a leader is your first day on the job. And they think a great deal about what it means to be a corporal and a leader. which is different than being a sergeant and a leader, which is different than being a captain and a leader, which is different than being a major or a colonel or on up the hierarchy. There's only about 7 fundamental levels of the hierarchy. And in their mind, every single one of them is a leadership position, every one, and they mean it. And the only thing that differs is the scope. If you're a corporal, your scope may be like this. If you're a sergeant, it may be like this, a captain like this. And yet the essence of leadership, the importance of a sense of responsibility, the importance of real commitment, caring deeply about what gets accomplished, the importance of relationships, that ultimately we have to do this together, is the same. It's just the particulars differ. So all those are things that have become really useful kind of in cornerstones in our journey. The importance of teams, rethinking what leadership is all about. It's really not about hierarchy. And conversely, if you can do that, you can start to make hierarchies effective because they are really useful. But the problem is they can concentrate power, and obviously they reinforce ego. So all the sins of organizations are often tied up with misunderstanding the role of hierarchy. And that, of course, carries over into other sectors. All of our work, when I got to know Tim, was in the business world. And the reason for that was very simple. It was because there was more openness. There was more openness to experiment. Uh, it's not just because businesses are the only organizations that matter. They're not. You know, you could make an argument from a society standpoint. The most important organizations are schools. They shape the future. It's the only institution in a society that has a time horizon of 50, 60, 70 years, because their success will shape the impact on a society over that long. Business doesn't have that kind of time horizon. Government doesn't have that kind of time horizon. So there's different types of organizations, and over the journey I've been fortunate to be on, got to work with all of them. And of course, the other big part of the journey is you start off wherever you start off, and for most of us, it's in our home country. But getting to work in many, many different countries and getting to see the importance of culture and the differences in culture and the similarities. There's nothing that I've said in the last 15 minutes that I would say any different to a group of Chinese or a group of Indians or a group of Africans. But their cultural context is very, very different. And to do the work well, you have to be connected to that culture. I would never try to do the sort of work I describe, really do it, not help other people do it, but in some way do it, in a culture that I didn't feel I really understood deeply. And even in the West, of course, the difference between the Germans and the French is actually rather significant. And the difference between the Portuguese and the Spanish is rather significant, even though they're proximitous cultures, right? They kind of grow up next to each other. They're still very, very different. So culture matters a lot. And oftentimes I discovered, one of the things I discovered getting to work with people in different cultural contexts all around the world is that most were more sophisticated on this point than Americans. Now, this is a big generalization, so please don't take it too seriously. But by and large, most people grow up in settings where they abut. They are continually in a process of interaction with different cultures. The Germans and the French have had to learn to get along because, by golly, they're always abutting. And a lot of those have had very unfortunate bits of history wrapped around them. So sometimes it brings with it great turmoil and great trauma, and consequently long-term attitudes and long-term antipathies, not just sympathies. But by and large, I discovered that this country is a very young culture. That gives it great vitality, but also, as we're all seeing today, great vulnerability. I did a program with a French sociologist once. We used a metaphor that I've never forgotten. He said, America is like a teenager. This session was probably 15 years ago. He said, America is like a teenager. It thinks the world revolves around it and it will never die. Sooner or later, America will encounter the crises of young adulthood, when you realize you're not immortal, you have friends who die, and the world does not revolve around you. But you're part of a network of interactions, and in some sense, you're not separate and different. You really are connected. And while you wouldn't say you're equal, that kind of has no meaning, you're equally important and equally legitimate. So I've always thought that was a very apt metaphor. And of course, in many, many ways, we're discovering we're probably in one of those crises of young adulthood today. So it's very painful. It's very traumatic. But we grow and develop through crises. It's a law of development for individuals, for teams, for organizations, for societies. So it's been an interesting journey, but those cornerstones have always been there. Let me say a word about how we were thinking about this morning. And I know I should say this moment, since it's morning for some of you and it's afternoon for some of you, and for me it's midday, maybe for a few of you it's even evening. This is the last of the scheduled sessions in the 8-day conference. So we thought we would try to use a good chunk of the time today to reflect, to give you a chance to reflect. What are some things that have really stood out for you? If you look back across some of the talks that you thought were the most exciting and the most meaningful, why were they? What excited you? What are some of the connections that you found yourself really mulling over? This could really help me in my work. Obviously, the common denominator connecting all of this is Tim and what Tim represents to all of us about legitimating the inner world, not just the outer world. I mean, when you think about it, it's just one world. It's really a figure of speech. We all experience what we experience through our experience. It is an inner phenomenon in that sense. It's our experience. Not a single one of us has a company in our head, nor do we have the United States of America in our head, nor do we have the world in our head, nor do we, these are concepts. We have notions about all of these. We have experiences. We have a lot of emotions about all of these, quote, external things. But the thread that's connected this whole conference has been Tim's diligent and creative effort to help us all become a little more aware that our awareness really does matter. There's no external world out there independent of the world in here. It shows up in here. There's an old saying in the philosophy of language, we do not describe the world we see the world we know how to describe. We do not describe the world we see the world we know how to describe. A woman does see a different world than a man. A Chinese person really does see a different world than a Westerner. An engineer sees a different world than a salesperson, and on and on and on. We see through our seeing. So the thread connecting all the things this week, of course, has been people with different ways of pointing to this simple truism. There's no world out there independent of the world in here. And very often we're so busy and so focused on the world out there, we forget the fact that the world in here is how we're interacting in that, how we're seeing it. And it's always operating. The problem is often we're not aware that it's operating. Along the journey in our work, we started to use the term mental models. We actually picked up that term from Shell. We were doing a lot of work with Shell right around the time I was getting to know Tim. And I found as a big corporation, Shell International or Royal Dutch Shell was very sophisticated because they were doing a lot of work with how to help managers see that their own seeing mattered, what they called their mental models. They used to say, hey, you can make all the plans you want, but the only plans that ultimately are going to matter are those which really challenge your own assumptions, your own mental models, your own taken for granted picture of the world. So that's the thread that all of the different speakers in this program have been exploring in different ways, which is to say to respect and honor and work with the fact that our awareness really does matter. There's always an inner game. There's always an inner talk. There's always this world inside us. And what does it mean at the individual level? What does it mean at a team level? What does it mean at an organizational level to take this seriously? Teams can develop very counterproductive mental models. I've been around a lot of teams who developed a siege mentality. They felt that nobody understood them and it was us against the world. And sooner or later, they paid a price for that mental model. They would close themselves off. They might do brilliant work, but they would be horrible at managing the interface between their work and all the people ultimately who they connected with and depended upon. And they could do brilliant work and end up as pariahs, as outcasts in their own organization. So that's a perfect example of how a collective mental model can develop in a team. And of course, organizations can develop mental models. Strategy is strategy, but what sits behind strategy is, when all is said and done, a lot of assumptions. And oftentimes we don't see the assumptions. And the assumptions make perfectly good sense to us until the world changes. And then we can't even see the change in the world sometimes because we're so determined to see what we're prepared to see. So this inner game stuff is not just philosophical. And it's certainly not just a romantic idealism that people like Tim Galway have been promoting for many decades. It's simply the essence of what it means to be effective in any setting. It's terribly practical. And the people who get really good at it are always grounded, just like Tim teaching that lady so long ago to play tennis, in a practical reality where in the end, you're either learning or you're not. You're either getting better at producing an outcome you want to produce or you're not. This is not, idle philosophizing. This is philosophy that has a first order impact on what we can accomplish in the world. So the way we've kind of bundled all that, and I'll suggest this as a bridge to what I want to do next, is the simple word reflection. So I'm going to ask you to do in a couple minutes is spend a couple minutes reflecting, holding the mirror up. There's an old saying in English, the eye cannot see the eye. Reflection is what we do to let ourselves see ourselves. So, and usually there's a few simple questions. I started a moment ago. I'll go back and repeat what I said about 3 or 4 minutes ago. If you look back over the course of these 8 days, what are some things that really struck you, that really surprised you, that you left either very puzzled or very inspired, but somehow there was a part of you that went, this matters. This could be important to me. This could really help us. There's something that I care about that I'm really trying to do, that this really would help in that. So that's what I mean by reflection. These are examples of reflective questions, because when I look at what really activates my own curiosity, what activates my own interest, I go from spontaneously, because, the body doesn't lie. The body signals our level of interest. This is one level of interest. This is another level of interest. If I look at what intrigued me in this way, what caught my attention, it doesn't necessarily mean I agreed with it. It certainly doesn't mean I understood it. That's really secondary. There's some things that really are important that initially we disagree with. Well, that seems crazy. That's fine. That's secondary. But what I want you to notice is 2 or 3 moments where something struck you as really important. Just grabbed your attention. And I'm going to ask you to think about that as evoking a question. What was the question that was being stirred up in me? All real learning processes, in my experience, have at their root a question that matters. Another partner long, long ago called them questions with heart and meaning. Questions with heart and meaning. We're not always aware of it as a question. We are aware that it intrigues us, and we are leaning in, as I was kind of illustrating a moment ago. Something is important here. But if I ponder that for a second, I think you'll see that it's evoking a question. How could I be better at? That would be an example of a question. What is my next step in getting better at doing that? Or, that seems really interesting, but how does it connect to the project I'm working on right now, or something that I'm doing right now? These are all illustrations of what I was asking you to give some thought to. If you look at something that really struck you over this last 8 days, what's a question that was being revealed? I always think that one of the most precious outcomes of a session like this, which is really just an opportunity to pause connect with different ideas, listen to different things. One of the most precious outcomes is a small set of really good questions that have heart and meaning for each of us, because we won't forget those. We'll forget a lot of what people said. We'll forget most of what people said. You're not going to remember what stuff I said in the last 20 minutes. Don't worry about it. That's not the way learning works. It triggers things. It triggers curiosity. We all know from our experience as a child, and maybe our experience around children, that what makes children masterful learners is only two things. They're really deeply curious and they're willing to try things. That's it. It's not complicated. So learning is always anchored in something I'm deeply curious about, and where I can imagine a kind of practice field or a place I can try it out, or I can try something new. The meeting we're going to have with my team on Monday or Wednesday next week, we could try something. So these are the two cornerstones of all learning: curiosity and experimentalism. The willingness to try something. But it all starts with curiosity. We're not going to invest time and energy trying something new that might not work, and where the negative consequences are not something we really are after. Because you try something, it may not work, and there's going to be consequences of it not working. You're not going to risk that unless you care. So that's why curiosity is the first principle. It's got to be something that really seems worthwhile. So I've said a few minutes, the same thing over and over again, with the hope that I'm triggering some reflections on your part. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, and it's nice if you have something to write on. I always keep a journal handy, but a piece of paper will do. If you want to use your gadget, that's fine. But actually now to write a couple of questions down. You may start off by just writing a little bit about something that really stirred up your interest. So as I said, sometimes the question isn't always self-evident at the beginning, but there was something that really struck you. You might just start with a name, Alan Kay. I'll pick Alan because I know him so well, and I know he spoke a couple of days ago. Alan said whatever, and it really got me interested. What was the question there? So kind of take a few minutes and write a little bit. What was it that caught your interest? Again, starts usually the simplest way, something that really stood out for me. And if I ponder that, some question that it's evoking or stirring up. And the question may literally have the form, how do I fill in the blank? Or how do I get better at fill in the blank? But it could be something that's a little different form of a question, but something that really you could say, yeah, my curiosity likes this question.
And people, you can share these thoughts in Q&A area, please.
Yeah. So what I'd like you to do first is just reflect a little on your own. Then when you're ready, you can share that in the chat room, in the Q&A area, as Renato said. And then what we'll do is we'll come back together in 5 minutes, and we'll just start to harvest some of these questions. We'll just listen to some of the questions. It's a nice way to reflect collectively. In other words, what I'm asking you to do first is a little personal reflection, and then we'll come together in about 5 minutes and listen to some of the questions, which is a nice way to reflect collectively. What sort of questions are being stirred up in us? Okay? So I would recommend first you write it someplace so you'll have it, because if you write it just in the chat room or the Q&A function, you won't necessarily have it for yourself. Because this is a question you may want to revisit tomorrow or a week from today. Okay, so whatever way you can kind of capture the question for yourself, take a few minutes, and after about 3 minutes or so, I'll suggest that if you haven't, you maybe want to enter it in the Q&A area. But make sure you capture it for yourself also, okay? And we'll have about 5 minutes of silence, and then we'll all come back together and look at some of the questions that are being generated. Take another minute or two. We'll come back together in about 2 more minutes. You take about 10 more seconds and then we'll come back together. If you haven't and you would like to, you can write some of your questions in the Q&A. And you can continue to do that even as we start up. That's fine. Okay, so what we'll start to do now, I'm going to ask for Renato to help, is he'll just start to read some of the questions. Now, obviously, there's going to be many, many more questions that would be really worth reading than we'll ever have time for. And my idea here is to not go right to a Q&A kind of session, but again, in the spirit of this is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the whole week. Um, First, just to hear some of the questions. So maybe after Renato reads 4, 5, or 6, we'll just pause and I'll offer some reflections of my own based on listening to the questions, and we'll probably repeat that cycle so that we call this in our work with organizations, or particularly all sorts of groups, developing a capacity to hold questions and hold each other's questions. The most important questions in life aren't the ones that have answers. If you think you're going to get answers to how to best raise your kids, you're going to wait a long time. If you're ever going to get an answer to how to be a good spouse or partner, you're going to wait a long time. These are life questions. These are not questions that have simple answers, but the questions really matter. And you might say, as I said earlier, there's nothing more precious than being clear about some of the questions that matter the most to you. Okay, so Renato.
Yes, Peter, we have a lot of not just questions, but also comments. I will start with one. He said, what I'm doing today is really fulfilling myself, my family, organization, or society. Do I really focus to follow, work, learn, to fulfill my dreams, or just too much concentrate on WhatsApp, YouTube, Netflix, because it's much easier? And another one here is from Jeffrey. I witnessed over these 7 days how inner game is like a DNA, and the diversity of speakers demonstrated the wide variety of life forms that manifested and evolved from the common DNA. Another one this week was to go out from my zone comfort or comfort zone. Lavina, what most intrigued me is that so many discoveries about the inner self that is to do with the connection with the inner self, whether it has been personal mastery, inner game, NLP, storytelling, and the magic in neurons has all happened between the 70s and now. Why has humanity felt the need to search for this at this juncture?
Hmm. Great question.
Hobby Sheet also says, how present am I when I'm coaching? I could notice my percentage of how present am I wishing on court. Amanda, how do I go about coaching and quietening the collective mind that Pete Carroll talked about? Another one from Dr. Ben Ko presentation. Curious and waiting to learn how to do a change, going from act, the word, the verb word, to noun process. Complete mindset set change. I was struck by the realization that modern television or smartphones have created a vortex of self-one, which has engrossed the majority of humanity into constructed realities directed by self-one.
That's great. Maybe we just pause for a second. I mean, these are wonderful. And I'm just noticing that, it takes a little while to really ponder and absorb some of the questions. So I think I've managed to get down the gist of most of them. And I'm just, first thing I notice is that it's been a really good week. You guys have really stirred up some great questions. Tim, you should consider this a great compliment. I mean, these are the kind of questions that really matter to people. I want to just pick out one thing that really did strike me as I was listening. Actually, is back in the very first question, and then it was reflected in different ways in the others. This is not easy work. It's a lot easier to sit back and do nothing. Really taking this inner development, this inner game seriously is wonderful and it's joyful and it's what we really, really long to do. That doesn't mean it's easy. It requires some real willingness to kind of confront things sometimes. You know, it's one thing to say, well, we've got negative internal images and internalized mental models that are counterproductive. And if we just really notice them, they'll lose a lot of their energy. That was obviously the story I was telling about Tim teaching tennis a long time ago. But really noticing them is not easy. There's a part of us that would like to pretend we don't have those. Fear is not something any of us are wanting to experience, nor is anger, nor is sadness. There's a lot of negative emotions, negative in the sense of emotions that are strong, powerful, and you might say we have a vested interest in avoiding them. Hence, we just, have some more pretzels and Netflix. I'm not opposed to either, by the way, but I understand the spirit of that comment, which was that we can escape into these things. And if you turn that around just a little bit more and kind of sit with that reflection, which to me is a very important one. On the one hand, the way I would express it very simply is on the one hand, there's something deep in us that draws us to want to learn. On the other hand, there's something deep in us that often makes us want to turn away from the fear or the anxiety or the negative emotions or whatever. So we're both drawn to it and pushed away. Obviously, individuals only progress and advance to be the people we could be, to develop ourselves as we might potentially develop by being willing to embrace this. This is what I was referring to as the hard work. But you can say the exact same thing in societies. And that was the point I was going to add. Societies can conspire. We can all work together to help all of us avoid difficult things. And guess what? Then I think the same thing occurs. Societies don't advance. They get stuck. They get rigidified. They become sources of reinforcing pain and suffering as opposed to joy. So I think a lot of these same principles apply collectively as well as individually. And if there's anything that to me would represent this moment we were all going through today, is as a society, we're being invited to look in the mirror. I mean, the question that started to come to me right away about 3 or 4 weeks ago was, could all the protests, the Black Lives Matters protests in the United States, which then, of course, started to turn out to be around the world, because every country has their suppressed people. Africans living in different countries in Europe have all the same problems as Africans or people who come from African heritage have living in this country. And there's plenty of other repressed minorities. The largest repressed minority in the world is the Dalit, or the untouchables of India. It's almost 200 million people who are literally, by definition, repressed. So this is a problem all societies have. Would we have been open to starting to embrace that particular suffering and pain if we hadn't had the pandemic first? That's a question that started to come to me. And I think the answer to me is pretty clearly no, because one of the things that really started to emerge as the epidemic has started to kind of sweep across our society is the disproportionate impact. About 3 times as many people have died who are either African American or Hispanic American as white. That's data. That's fact. That's not opinion. That's not somebody's kind of diatribe about racism. That's simple fact. And I think we've all seen that, and we go, wait a second. This is not bad luck. This is not random. This is systemic. There's something deeply embedded in our societies in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of living conditions, in terms of fear and being comfortable going to a physician, all kinds of things. And that has, of course, then opened up our capacity to start to look at things that we otherwise would like to turn away from. So that was the main reflection I just wanted to add. I thought all of your questions were beautiful, but to recognize that there is a part of us that's really drawn to learning, and there's a part of us that doesn't want to learn. And that's true collectively as well as individually. And depending on how that balance unfolds, I'm not saying we shouldn't be averse to learning. Hey, fear is a natural phenomenon, and nobody in their right mind ignores fear. Pay attention to fear. On the other hand, if you allow the fear to dictate, you don't advance, you don't learn, you don't develop. And the same is true of societies. So anyhow, Renato, why don't we go back to reading a few more of the questions?
Yeah, we have one here from Leonor. She said, it felt so good to listen to the human side of speakers. A lot of inspirations, a breath of fresh air. It felt simple and sometimes too easy to understand. I have another one here, is from David. I was stuck by stop to step back, think, organize, and proceed. I realized how fast society have become prescriptive and judgmental, and how rarely we give ourselves time to observe and to learn.
Thank you.
I have another one here, is how connected am I versus how much do I like the sound of my own voice. Mr. Dungel, how can I bring change in what I've been doing for the last 1 decade so that I am more satisfied and impart more satisfaction to my family and people I'm serving. One more from Jude. Reflying importance of preparation, awareness, learning, observing, yet there will still be uncertainties I cannot account for. Can I accept the consequence of a big problem not being able to return to my base or airport? Because we had, Peter, here we had one of our speakers did an analogy with flying.
Uh-huh. Can you tell me what the analogy was, just so I can make sure to understand that comment?
Yes, it's, she said, flying, referent this flying, it was the importance of preparation, awareness, learning, observing, yet there will be still some uncertainties I cannot account for. Can I accept the consequence of a big problem not being able to return to my base or airport?
Beautiful image.
Another question is from Anna. How can I develop the patience to allow the system to correct itself?
Mm. Mm.
Kate has some questions inspired in Nikki Askew presentation. Said, how can I use silence more? How can I simplify what I'm doing? Keep it simple. And then something poorly defined that I'm pondering about in my coaching work, making sure I am communicating with the part of the person that learns, not their head that gets coughing ideas, knowledge, outside information as answers.
Those are wonderful. Maybe I offer a few more comments. In a few minutes, I need to turn it over to Tim. He's going to do a closing session. But I want to just pause on one or two things that there was a lot in those last series of questions, but one or two that strike me as being especially important. For us in different ways at different ages, and I'll explain what I'm meaning by this. The comment that I'm going to start with was the one about the importance of stopping. That's reflection. Pause. Give some real time. What just happened there? And the reason I wanted to underscore and repeat that comment was that if you look at the last few decades, you look at the last 30, 40 years, everything is speeded up so much. And I find this particularly poignant in the lives of children and young people. It's happened for all of us. But I mean, it was 5 years ago. I was sitting in a restaurant in New York and watched 5 young Chinese people come and sit at a table next to us. And within about 10 seconds, they all had their gadgets out. So here they are. It was such a beautiful metaphor, sitting at this table with each other, each of them looking at their gadgets. It was just like a knee-jerk reaction. They didn't even think about it. And so that perpetual state of distractedness, I don't think we talked about it before, but it's so obvious. That little film at Tim's I was using as kind of a touch point for this whole business of your journey. The woman is not distracted. She's paying attention. And in a sense, Tim's pedagogy is pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And that is what is really being compromised today. You can see this especially in a poignant way when you talk with educators. Educators don't know what to do about the kids and their gadgets because, in many ways, in a very exploitative way, the businesses have decided that if you can addict people to their gadget, who knows what you can sell, right? Who knows what you can do with that attention? And I think that Otto Scharmer made an observation not too long ago, just as it took us a long time, probably a few decades, to realize that the unintended side effect of our desire for cheap energy was the pollution that the fossil fuel industries produce, and ultimately now the pollution of climate destabilization at a global level. But that was not the intended outcome, and no one even noticed for a long time. Just so, the unintended side effect of the social media is the pollution of the mental domain, this state of continuous distractedness. One of the pictures, I don't like to use PowerPoint slides when I do presentations, but I do occasionally like to use a picture. I have one picture, probably one I've used as much as any in the last 10 years. I do a lot of work in education, primary and secondary education. Because as I said earlier, you can make an argument that while business is the most powerful institution in modern society, education is the most important. It's a picture of a 8-year-old Chinese girl doing calligraphy. China has been reintroducing calligraphy into primary education. It's a very old part of their education system. In the old Chinese education system, I mean old like 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, every student did calligraphy. And this picture is so lovely. This girl who looks like she could be, 15, just because of her facial attention, but I think is actually about 8 years old. If you look really closely, she's very young. She's holding her brush. And it's such a beautiful image of concentration in the best sense. When you do one thing and you're really attending to that. And of course, that was the reason calligraphy was a cornerstone of traditional Chinese education, because it was believed that developing the ability to do one thing was a lifelong gift. And naturally, we move a lot. We have a lot on our mind. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all different this way. We have different predispositions. I actually think some of us do multitasking very well because it's natural for us. But even when you're multitasking, you're doing one thing, and then you're doing another thing, and you're doing another thing. The famous Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, when asked what one of his life goals is, he says, one of my life goals has been to notice each breath for one full day. I've never made it. I've always missed a few. But that ability to pay attention is, in my opinion, one of the cornerstones of really successful professionals in any domain. And that's being compromised. And paying attention takes a little bit of time. So that's the other reason I think this whole discipline of reflection is so important. Whenever we teach, doesn't matter if it's 5-year-olds or 50-year-olds, we make sure the part of the rhythm of the instruction or the teaching process is quiet time to journal, just like we did today. We did it for 5 minutes. But that slowing down is precious. You might say there's no more precious commodity in the world than human attention. Once we lose the capacity to govern our own attention, which is exactly what the effects of a lot of the social media are. You might say it goes back to the mass media. You mentioned the Netflix before. You can make a choice to watch a movie, right? That's fine, it's a choice. But once we lose the capacity to choose how we manage our attention, then our attention is up for sale. Then our attention can be quickly grabbed and manipulated in using all kinds of different media. This is one of the reasons that Thomas Jefferson wrote extensively about the success of a democracy would rise or fall with the quality of public education, because people need to learn how to think, how to understand what it means to think for themselves, how to govern their attention so they can give time to think about something. Life is actually complicated. And there's a famous line by, I think it was the famous short story writer Thurber, American writer, who said, "For every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's wrong."
Mhm.
It's very easy for people to be manipulated by lots of simple answers to complex problems that are simply wrong if they've lost the capacity to govern their attention. So it's a slightly different way to end this week-long journey, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim now momentarily. But for me, one simple thread that sits in this weave of the inner game is, in many ways, it's a teaching, it's a reminder of a teaching that there's few things more important in life than learning how to govern our own attention, learning how to give attention consciously as a choice. And then notice all the ways we get distracted. Distraction is part of life. That's not bad. The problem is we don't notice when we're distracted a lot of times. So to notice, oh, I'm distracted right now. I actually want to pay attention to this. A lot of the joy in life, in my opinion, real happiness, the key is learning how to give attention to something by choice. Thank you all. Tim, thanks for the invitation.
Peter, thank you so very much. Too many decades, and but something is the same. The passion for unlocking the potential of learning in people, individuals, teams, organizations. It's the word is evolution. And we kind of have to grow up if we're going to meet the world challenges we're facing. These aren't corporate challenges, these are world challenges. And it's going to make us think we're part of a human family, not Americans are first or best. It's There's enough food on the planet, but many are starving. That's a simple fact. And you start looking at the obstacles that allow that fact, and it's quite a mirror to look at.
Yes, quite a mirror.
Peter, thank you. Peter, thank you very much for your help. It was amazing. We received a lot of questions and comments. Then thank you so much for your generosity to be with us closing the event. We hope to see you soon again in a more in-depth program, maybe.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.